Welcome to the 2020 Effect, a podcast concept by Chau, Sarah, and Simoñ. I, Sarah, will be talking about the script component of the podcast. Simoñ will be running down the logo, and Chau will be covering the music and sound effects. So, what's our concept? The 2020 Effect is a podcast for young creative minds to unpack the media and sounds of 2020. Our title, The 2020 Effect, is something that we've collectively chosen for this series. It gives name to the effect that the sound has upon the world in 2020 and the ongoing effect that these sounds have upon humankind. So this gives the listener an idea of the subject matter already just from the title. This podcast series concept will be based around the media sounds of 2020 and will be exploring the cognitive connections made to sounds and the emotions associated with these sounds. So grief, concern, anger, uncertainty, loss, love, and hope. 2020 has been a cataclysmic year, to say the least, and we want to understand how the sounds of 2020 have impacted and changed lives across the globe. So this podcast series will be focusing on the influence of both media and sound, with the central question being, how do you feel?
The logo. Our podcast artwork inspiration comes from looking through windows during isolation. We created multiple variations and decided to use black as the primary color as it draws attention to various emotions. The arch window is a direct reference to being restricted to one's home and the observations, the environment outside with a deep sense of displacement for our daily routine. This idea was inspired by imagery from photographers documenting COVID. The juxtaposition font style is used to demonstrate the distortion of 2020. This font also has a duality to the movie The Matrix, as there is the glitch in the system.
The script. So the script for this podcast is separated into two parts. Firstly, we have the introduction, where we welcome the listeners to the episode, introduce the subject matter, and set the tone for the podcast. Our acknowledgement of country is acknowledging the significance of the land upon which the podcast was created. And then we have our outro. So that is thanking the listeners, thanking the people who made this episode possible. That's RMIT. And a reminder to subscribe to our podcast channel, and then finally wrapping up with an invitation to join us for our next episode. So the intro just quickly says who the hosts are and says join us with our stories from across the globe. And then we've got the acknowledgement of country. And then the outro is just wrapping up the episode and ensuring our listeners will tune in for our next podcast episode. And here's an example of our intro and outro.
Huge bushfires burning out of control right
has
now
been hit by
for the Black Lives Matter movement.
President Trump has been
an anti-mask rally.
Friends have lost their battle with coronavirus, marking the country's
Welcome to the 2020 Effect, a podcast created by RMIT students for young creative minds to unpack the sounds and media of 2020. The 2020 Effect will explore the soundtrack of 2020 and the turbulent experience that has been the year so far. I'm your host, Sarah, and I'll be joined by Chau and Simoñ. Join us as we share with you sounds and stories from across the globe. As RMIT Media Communication students, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we so graciously stand upon today, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nations, and recognise their ongoing connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. That's all we've got time for today. Please join us for the next episode of the 2020 Effect. Thank you to our guests, to RMIT and to our listeners for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channel. Stay safe and we'll see you next time.
So I'll be discussing the music and sound effect component of our presentation. For the music, I was inspired by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, and so I recorded some ambience soundscape and some synth pads while trying to avoid some acoustics. For quick research, I listened to The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Gone Girl's soundtrack, where I mainly focus on the foreground as the background is towards dark ambience. I noticed that a lot of these soundtracks use some bells, and I decided to incorporate to the songs. For the intro music, we aim to convey the mood of curiosity, as it establishes the overall podcast aesthetics. The intention of the music was to create an original song that caters to only our podcast. So we try to avoid royalty-free music as everyone has access to it. So this kind of enhance our brand, as you could say. The intro music kind of starts off with a fade in of a warm hypnotic synth that has some layers of bells to create a calming balance, but we wanted to keep it upbeat when the dynamic changes with other soundscapes and strums that kind of layer over it. And then the intro kind of starts to build up with some chimes and string elements are recorded, and then to increase the intensity, but in a pleasant way. However, we don't want the intensity too high to overthrow the script, as the music should be not the dominant foreground. For the intro sound effects, we kind of want to establish our genre of the podcast, so the use of it. We wanted to create the illusion that the audience are listening to the radio, or we could create some sort of environment to the listeners that they're watching the news, like they are switching the channels and such. The use of the montage and the static sound effects is to tell the audience what the 2020 effect is. And the montage we collected, we kind of don't want to heavily emphasize on COVID-19 because there are many things happening in the world, and this kind of gives us some ideas on podcast episodes. For the outro music, kind of starts the same way as the intro music because I wanted to create a sort of trademark in our podcast. I think this is important because we want our listeners to recognize our podcast by having a memorable score. However, I wanted to have some texture and layers, so it is not completely the same as the intro music. And so I just added a bit of guitar strums and some reverbs. And then the outro music kind of builds up to a ringing, echoey sound that concludes the podcast. So, yeah. Thank you for listening to our pitch and hope you vote for us if you like our idea. Thank you.